Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Moya Lothian-McLean, and tonight, as bi-weekly is tradition, I will be joined by the wonderful Shon Faye.
Hi, Moya. I'm looking forward to spilling the tea, the political tea. Boston Tea Party vibe.
Okay, I think we should end the show there. We can't get any better than that. But we will be talking about Rishi Sunak's attempt to play to the Conservative base. We will also be discussing tonight the ongoing plight of the junior doctors and the government's refusal to negotiate on favourable terms. And we'll be talking about French protesters storming a Louis Vuitton store. Personally, I'm more of a Givenchy person myself. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has given an interview to Conservative Home, and as you'd expect, it was a pretty cosy affair, with the Tory membership submitting their questions in advance. I'd imagine a fair amount of vetting went on because nothing too controversial came up, and we all know that Sunak isn't that popular with the membership, who love Boris Johnson as much as Nadine Dorries, and who even preferred Liz Truss to the current Prime Minister. Now, the ghost of Boris Johnson made an early entrance, with Conservative Home editor Paul Goodman asking Sunak this.
Some, not all but some, say, look, Rishi Sunak, you were instrumental in the fall of Boris Johnson. He was elected with a big majority. He had a mandate from the voters that, let's be frank, you don't have yet, may not have, who knows. He had a mandate from the Conservative Party, which you don't have either because you didn't win the leadership election in the summer. What's your answer to those Conservatives and Conservative and other voters who have a problem with trust?
Well, I think we addressed all of this last summer and we talked about it extensively. I made the decision I made for reasons that were personal to me. And, there was a fundamental difference about economic policy, and that was something that I was clear about at the time. And ultimately, that's why I had to resign. And that was that. And I was pretty clear and transparent about it at that moment. What happened thereafter was not my doing, right? And lots of other, we won't go. There's no point re-going over all of that, quite frankly, because I think we've got to, as a party, look forward.
Is the door closed to Boris Johnson coming into your cabinet?
I think I got asked about this in the past. I didn't comment on cabinet appointments. You wouldn't expect me to do that with Boris or anybody else for that matter. We've got a great team. We've got a great team, and they're focused on delivering. But more broadly, it's great that we've got former prime ministers who want to contribute still to public life and feel that they can do that. That's a good thing, and we should welcome that.
Have they got a great cabinet team? I'm not really that sure about that. Maybe Sunak should leave the door open to getting Johnson out on the campaign trail if the Tories are still mobilising an election next year. Now, another topic that came up was hot favourite for Wedge issue of the year. With Keir Starmer having recently come down against trans women, Sunak needed to up the stakes. Here's Paul Goodman again.
Sir Keir said recently that 99% of women, I quote, of course, haven't got a penis, he said. What percentage would you put it at?
So I have a slightly different point of view to him on this. And I've been very clear that when it on this topic,
it's 100%.
Yeah, of course. But I think the first thing to say is, look, we should always have compassion and understanding and tolerance for those who are thinking about their gender. Of course we should, right? We're a compassionate and understanding society, and we will always remember that. But when it comes to these issues of protecting women's rights, women's spaces, I think the issue of biological sex is fundamentally important when we think about those questions. I've said that repeatedly, and that's why I talked about the Equalities Act last year. It's why Secretary of State Kemi written to the Commission. They've responded with some advice about the Equalities Act and how it should think about biological sex. We're in the process of looking at that. But as a general kind of operating principle for me, biological sex is vitally, fundamentally important to these questions. We can't forget that. And that's why we need to make sure, particularly when it comes to women's health, women's sports, or indeed spaces, that we're protecting those rights and those places.
Compassionate and understanding society that insists on consistently talking about women and penises. That sounds very compassionate and understanding to me. Sunak also mentioned the EHRC there, who recently advised the government to change the Equalities Act in a way that defines woman and biologically female. We will be talking about that organisation and its crumbling infrastructure later in the show after it has been captured by Tory plants. Now, though, take a look at this. Look familiar? The Tories have been plastering that slogan, cribbed straight from Australia's inhuman migration policy, on every lectern short enough to keep Sunak's face in. But it seems that that policy, which was one of Sunak's key pledges at the beginning of the year, isn't going so well. Here's Goodman again.
On to a different matter, namely the pledge that stands out in some ways from the others, small boats. You were pledged to stop the boats, not reduce the number, not bring the number down, actually just stopping them. Will you have done that by the time of the next election?
Look, I've always also said that this is not something that is, easy. It is a complicated problem where there's no single simple solution that will fix it. And I've also said it won't happen overnight.
Won't happen overnight, and it won't happen ever until we've established safe routes for asylum seekers. In the same chat, Sunak let slip a particularly interesting detail. Remember his decision last year to scrap compulsory national targets of building 300,000 new homes a year in England. At the time, media reported that it was a Tory rebellion, an MP one, that saw the targets ditched. But Sunak has now suggested a different reason.
Why should young people vote for the party of capitalism when they've got so little stake and capital of their own?
Are you talking specifically about home ownership? Or
home ownership is the prime example, but you might talk about shares, you might talk about anything. The concentration of wealth in this country, it's frankly, with my generation, not younger people, why should they vote Conservative in May?
Well, let's talk about home ownership specifically, because I think that is probably the best example of what you're talking about, Paul. And I think, first of all, I remember what it was like to get the keys to my first flat. That's a special moment in everybody's life. Everyone wants to own. The vast majority of people want to own a home, and that's something that we as a party have always been, are, and will continue to be incredibly supportive of. Now, we have to acknowledge, yes, that has been, as you say, right? That dream feels like it's out of reach for too many people. Part of our job is to try and help correct that. It's not an easy thing to do, so I think we should be honest about it. It's not something that you can fix overnight, but I think we are making progress. And I spent a lot of the time over the summer, actually, when I was talking to so many of our members, so many of our councillors about our planning system and their views on it. And what I heard consistently, particularly from our councillors and our members, was what they didn't want was a nationally imposed, top-down set of targets imposed, telling them what to do.
Goodman asked a pretty pertinent question there, one worthy of Novara Media, actually. Why should young people vote for the party of capital when they have so very little? Sunak, tellingly, isn't able to come up with an answer, because the answer is you shouldn't vote for the party of capital. But he did give the rationale for his U-turn on house building targets. And apparently it's Conservative members and councillors. Quite how they represent the majority of the country, or the young people Goodman was specifically asking about, is unclear. Or according to the Times, Tory members represent less than 1% of the electorate, and over 60% are older than 55. That is compared to only 26% of the general UK population. Plus, they're predominantly middle-class men who live in the south-east of the country. But yes, this group definitely reflects the general public's attitude towards home building targets. Shon, Rishi Sunak decided to talk about small boats, women with penises, and also house building targets that apparently the Conservative membership don't want, and that for the rest of the country do. Does he have any strategy at all, or is he just a management bod out of his depth?
No, I don't think he has a strategy at all. I think what we're seeing is a flailing government trying to grasp at anything that they think will work. I do think that this question about the way that young people are voting, obviously, it's sort of famously that millennials are not getting more conservative with age, which is something that the Tory party in this country and Conservatives around the world have always really relied on. But the reason that tends to happen is not just because you naturally become small-minded or selfish with age, more just that you tend to become richer, and that's not happening to millennials. So there is a real problem there in terms of creating a narrative of optimism. I mean, even Thatcher, I guess, for some aspirational working class people, had a narrative of optimism, of social mobility. There's none of that here. He's wildly unpopular. He's gratuitously wealthy, and I think a lot of the public find him gratuitously wealthy and out of touch. And so, yeah, I think what we're seeing is really these sort of like hallmarks of a deeply reactionary government in its sort of increasing vitriol towards minorities. And as I think I have said on this program before, the two minorities in the UK right now that seem to stand out are trans people and migrants, people who are migrating to this country, usually fleeing war, persecution. And yeah, I think we're going to see, unfortunately, in the lead up to the next general election, which hopefully they will lose, increasing use of scapegoats and increasingly desperate measures.
The junior doctors' strike has now moved into its third day. And while the industrial action is causing delays in NHS treatment, it's also making the government look ever more unreasonable. The Doctors' Union, the BMA, has invited the government to enter into talks through the arbitration service ACAS. BMA leader Philip Banfield told Times Radio this. I've been talking to ACAS about the possibility of breaking down some of the preconditions that have been put on the juniors by this government to try and get this dispute resolved as quickly as possible. The fundamental issue here is that we have a Secretary of State that doesn't seem to appreciate that pay for junior doctors has gone down in real terms. The BMA's invitation to negotiate via ACAS comes after Health Secretary Steve Barclay has repeatedly refused to negotiate with the junior doctors unless they substantially lower their demand for pay restoration. That demand amounts to a 35% increase in order to restore real wages to 2008 levels. For their part, the doctors have argued that they're willing to negotiate, but only face-to-face with the government. And now the body that represents NHS trusts across the country has weighed in too. The NHS Confederation has written to the government and to the BMA, asking both to enter into talks with the arbitration service ACAS. In their letter, the Confederation write this. While we await what we hope is inevitable eventual negotiation, our members are questioning how much damage will be caused along the way. Health leaders want both sides to do everything within their power to find some common ground as soon as possible, and it seems that the current approach is not working here. We now are urging you both to invite ACAS, the Advisory, Conciliation and Arbitration Service, or another mediation service to support negotiations and help bring this industrial action to a close. With both sides having seemingly incompatible preconditions for negotiation, we believe this option should be explored as a matter of urgency to help bring both sides to the table and find a way forward. As always, we stand ready to support in any way we can to bring an end to this industrial action and allow the NHS to get on with the good work that patients need. I wish I had ACAS in my last breakup. So what was the government's response to the invitation? Radio 4's Today programme put that question to Minister for Policing Chris Philp and brace yourself for a car crash that really needed a junior doctor.
The BMA have made a shift, haven't they? They're not talking about the 35% as much as they are talking about a credible offer. They have said, we're ready to sit down with ACAS. ACAS say they're ready. They just need all the parties, and that means the government. Why not just say yes in a strike where lives are at stake? That's not the case in every strike, but it is in this one. Yes to ACAS. It's not something that involves you having to agree anything. It's a process. It's a discussion.
Well, that is a very recent change in position. That wasn't the BMA Junior Doctors Committee's position until very, very recently. I think it would also be constructive if they would just suspend the strikes while talks take place. And if they're willing to do that, then I think the Secretary of State's door is very much open. And we demonstrated, we took exactly that approach with the relevant trade unions in relation to ambulance paramedics and nurses. A reasonable offer was made that is now being balloted on. So there's a very clear way of getting this resolved that we used just a few weeks ago, and we'd encourage the BMA Junior Doctors Committee to follow the same process because our door is open.
They've shifted. As you have acknowledged, there's been a different stance from them as of yesterday. ACAS are ready. Why can't you just say yes to talking to them in that setting?
Well, I think if they obviously I'm not the Health Secretary, if they put that suggestion to the Health Secretary directly and express a willingness and a willingness to suspend the extremely damaging strike action that some hospital leaders say is putting patient safety at risk, then the Secretary of State's door is open. So I would urge them to make formal contact, not through the media, but directly with the Secretary of State to put their proposal to the Secretary of State. But I would suggest that should include suspending the current strike action while talks take place.
So The government's line is they won't even enter arbitration about how a negotiation might take place unless the doctors give up all their leverage by suspending the strikes and also put a lower offer on the table. And by this afternoon, nothing had changed, with the Department for Health issuing this statement. The Health and Social Care Secretary has been clear his door is open and he remains willing to engage constructively, but that a demand of 35%, which would involve some junior doctors receiving a £20,000 pay rise, is unreasonable in the current economic context. We've been engaging with ACAS during this dispute and remain open to considering whether there is a role for them to help us reach the desired outcome, an end to strike action, which is putting patient safety at risk. But our position remains that the Junior Doctors Council needs to significantly reduce its demand for a 35% pay increase and pause action for formal talks to begin. And that will not change. Shon, why is the government so unserious about finding a resolution to this conflict?
Well, I think they just don't want a resolution. I think one of the things they've been hoping for this whole time is that public opinion will turn on junior doctors. That certainly, I think, has been a strain running through this entire dispute. The idea that if they sort of long it out for enough time, people will get sick of not receiving care and will not direct their anger at the government, but at junior doctors. I also think fundamentally there is an ideological block here, right? Is that they don't fundamentally believe that junior doctors are worth a pay increase. Because there is, most of the people in the Tory party probably access healthcare privately. There is a sort of underlying ideological belief that healthcare isn't something that should be free to all at the point of use, and that this health service that is free to all at the point of use that we have in the UK isn't something really the Tories have ever wanted. And I think especially now, they're very disinclined to actually take negotiations with junior doctors seriously, because they're not interested in the end result, which is a healthy, functioning NHS with staff morale high and, robust, good public healthcare. It's just not. It's not the Tory way. It never has been.
It isn't the Tory way. They prefer paying through the nose for substandard care. Now, the doctor strike isn't just about pay and conditions, as Shon pointed out. It's also about the collapsing health service. And the number of people on hospital waiting lists has hit an all-time high. The Independent reports this. An estimated 7.22 million people were waiting to start routine hospital treatment at the end of February, up slightly from 7.21 million in January, and the highest total since records began in 2007, according to figures from NHS England. According to the House of Commons Library, vacancies in the NHS are now at an unprecedented level. In September last year, there were nearly 140,000 vacancies for workers of various kinds in the NHS. There were nearly 10,000 spots for doctors, that's the light green area at the bottom of this graphic, and around 50,000 nursing vacancies, the dark green area in the middle. And for other workers, which includes vital health workers who are neither doctors nor nurses, there are around 80,000 vacancies. That is the purple area taking up the top of the graph. But did you know there are actually thousands of nurses, doctors, and other health workers already in Britain, but they're unrecorded, and that is because they're trapped in a broken asylum system. The Doctors Association of the UK has called for the government to get its act together, saying this. It is a clear failure of government thinking to not allow qualified individuals who are present in the country and willing to work, but are prevented from doing so due to bureaucratic failures. Nobody benefits from the situation, neither the public nor the individuals caught in this traumatic set of circumstances. That comes off the back of a report this weekend that thousands of doctors, nurses, and other health workers are stuck in the asylum system. Shon, this is a ridiculous situation where it seems the government would rather have people trapped in an asylum system that they claim costs them millions of pounds than let them work in the NHS where they are desperately needed. How has it happened? What does it tell us about priorities?
Well, I think it tells us a lot about what the asylum system is designed to do, which I think that there's a large part of it that is theatre, right? It's theatrical. Is that as we become an increasingly xenophobic, hostile nation state, to go hand in hand with that needs to be the theatre of the border, of the asylum system, that it's difficult, it's hard, that we are punishing people for claiming asylum, for migrating to this country. And in order to do that is to create like a web of bureaucracy that is dense, is designed to be difficult to circumvent, is designed to privilege rich immigrants rather than the poorest. And I think, when you combine that with, as I mentioned before, a real lack of interest in actually improving the conditions within the NHS and making sure that it's staffed properly, you've got basically two different prongs, if you like, of Tory ideology interacting here, so that you have this bizarre situation in which there are plenty of people qualified in Britain already to do this, this highly specialist work, yet we have a system that basically prevents them from doing it, and no interest in simplifying that, or I don't know, just applying. It's not just about failure of common sense. It's actually about two different ideological, permutations of Tory policy interacting, would be my assessment.
I think it's really fascinating to watch the evolution of the Tory party go from sort of, we're the grown-ups, we're in charge, we can do this, to this post-2016, 2019 intake where incompetence rules the roost, and above all, they just want to continually shoot themselves in the foot again and again and again in pursuit of this bizarre ideological goal that doesn't even make sense to them. It's just doing rubbish politics for the sake of rubbish politics. Are the French here to play? Absolument pas, and je suis désolé for my terrible pronunciation. Protesters have made their anger at the French government known in towns and cities across France for weeks now. There have been nationwide protests, occupations of buildings, and widespread civil disobedience. Strikes by French bin collectors left Parisian streets heaving with rubbish for 3 weeks in March. Some 2,500 fires, I don't know who's counting this, have been lit since mid-March, and around 300 public buildings vandalised. And national transport infrastructure, from ports to trains and buses to planes, have at times been all but halted. The state has met the protesters with violence, calling in unprecedented numbers of police to quell the disruption. They've been criticised for their heavy-handed tactics, which have resulted in around 1,200 arrests. And all of this came amid a cost of living crisis, and after President Emmanuel Macron bypassed Parliament to push through pension reforms, unilaterally raising the retirement age from 62 to 64. Macron's bill is now in the process of being examined by France's Constitutional Council, the country's highest legislative authority, and they're due to rule on its legality on Friday, a big day. And in a fresh national day of action, some 600,000 protesters have now taken to the streets again to let the council know their views. So far, striking rail workers have invaded the Paris headquarters of luxury brand empire LVMH. Its chief executive is Bernard Arnault, who recently became the richest man in the world. It owns luxury brands like Louis Vuitton, Moya, Christian Dior, and Givenchy. Basically, Versailles vibes. And the government is confident that the Constitutional Council will rule in their favour. No doubt it will. So far, Macron has refused to meet with union leaders to discuss the reforms. Speaking from the Netherlands, where he's currently visiting/hiding in a little lair, Macron said this: "I'm proud of the French social model and I defend it. But if we want to make it sustainable, we have to produce more. We have to reindustrialise the country. We have to decrease unemployment. And we have to increase the quantity of work being delivered in the country. This pension reform is part of it." We have to increase the quantity of work being delivered in the country. But for who, whom, and by who? Shon, what could we, the British people, learn from the French?
Apart from how to, look chic in just neutral tones. Versailles vibes indeed. Let them eat Louis Vuitton clutches. I think, we do have a lot to learn from the French. I think we could even learn a crumb of their tradition, I guess, of protest. I mean, it's that classic, I think there are lots of metrics, right? The French have a lot better living conditions than a lot of their European siblings, counterparts. And one would perhaps infer that is because they're willing to kick off any willing moment. I mean, what we are seeing now is Macron, for now, is not backing down. But what you have to remember is that this willingness to protest, how many ideas get killed before they're even floated to the French public because they know that they're going to kick off? And I actually think that what we see in this country is, unfortunately, a government that is, for too long, has been shown that they can pretty much do anything, and there won't be, unfortunately, much protest. And of course, it's about the sheer numbers. There are, of course, many civil disobedient activists, direct action activists on the left in this country, but because they are smaller in number, they're extremely vulnerable. The state comes down on them hard. It always has. And that obviously wrecks lives and can destroy, reputations, careers, etc., mental health. And so it's a tough thing here to be a sort of activist against state overreach. Whereas in France, there is, égalité and solidarité. These French accents, Moya.
You are actually a bit French, so I feel like I can get away with it more than my French accent is terrible. An interesting side note is actually that Bernard Arnault is now the richest man in the world thanks to the demand for luxury goods. Shon, you are a luxury gal. What does it say about our current moment that someone like Bernard Arnault and his LVMH empire has overtaken the tech gods?
I mean, thank you for calling me a luxury gal. First of all, I mean, the thing is that I think the fashion industry, just like many other industries, is just this huge globalization conglomeration. I think the business of fashion, has huge ethical questions over it. That essentially what is happening is that pretty much all major fashion houses gradually over time are being acquired into ever larger structures. And to be honest, I think all that shows is that there is a huge amount of money in the fashion and beauty industry. There always has been. And that, like every other industry, there are parasitic billionaires willing to skim off the profits of other people's labor. I think it is interesting, like on the left, that we tend to maybe turn our eyes towards other industries, perhaps like tech and industry. But I think the fashion industry, is one of those fascinating things where actually, I don't know, there is an artistic creative side to it, but the business of it very much is the domain of extremely wealthy people to what I would consider an unethical degree.
All is not well at the Equality and Human Rights Commission. According to a Vice exclusive, an internal battle is raging over the organisation's, quote, transphobic direction. And this has led to some, quote, massive resignations, some taking place as recently as this week. Reporter Ben Hunt has unearthed that 7 senior officials have quit the Equalities and Human Rights Watchdog in recent months. And they include an EHRC board member, known as a commissioner, an executive director, 4 directors, including 2 legal directors, and a committee member. You know what they say, to lose one committee member is misfortune, to lose a commissioner, well. Previously, staff have resigned from the watchdog in protest at the guidance regarding transgender people and their rights, but never figures this senior. And these departures at the top of the HRC's tree are directly linked to its most controversial decision yet. In early April, the watchdog made public a letter it had written to the government backing the crusade of Equalities Minister Kemi Badenoch to change the 2010 Equality Act. Badenoch wants to make it that the protections currently afforded according to a person's legal sex would instead be based on their biological sex, meaning trans people living a different sex than the one they were assigned at birth would lose a huge sweep of relevant legal protections, along with being permanently misgendered by the state. You would think an equalities and human rights watchdog that bills itself as independent from the government might be opposed to any plan that threatened to whisk away key human rights from a vulnerable minority group, but alas, no. Here's what the EHRC said in response to Badenoch's request for guidance. We have come to the view that if sex is defined as biological sex for the purposes of the Equality Act, this would bring greater legal clarity in 8 areas. On balance, we believe that redefining sex in the Equality Act to mean biological sex would create rationalisations, simplifications, clarity and/or reductions in risk for maternity service providers and users of other services, gay and lesbian associations, sports organisers and employers. It therefore merits further consideration. I'm hearing this. We debunked this EHRC advice at length in a previous show, but safe to say that this performance of pretending to be an independent body that is responding carefully and objectively to the government's concerns around the Equality Act is exactly that, a pantomime. For months, the EHRC has fielded allegations of increasing transphobia within its ranks. The appointment of Baroness Kishore Faulkner as chairwoman of the EHRC in 2020 saw, quote, multiple meetings set up between Faulkner and anti-trans organisations fighting specifically to have trans women excluded from single-sex spaces. And previous Vice reporting on leaked emails and documents revealed Faulkner was meeting representatives from the likes of the LGB Alliance and Fair Play for Women. The current deputy of the EHRC Commission is also Alistair Henderson, a lawyer who represented claimant Kira Bell in an attempt to prevent children under the age of 16 who were considering gender reassignment from accessing reversible puberty-blocking medication. With equalities champions like that, who needs enemies? But the entire top shelf of the EHRC is stacked with right-wingers. Our very own Stephen Methan penned this for Novara Media last September. As Women's and Equalities Minister, Liz Truss was responsible for commissioner appointments. She stacked the EHRC with right-wing ideologues. One, David Goodhart, described BLM protesters as statistically naive and said the Windrush scandal shouldn't halt the Tories' hostile environment policies. Another, Jessica Butcher, stated that women should not go to cry to someone about how you might have been gender discriminated against, but take ownership of how you put yourself forward and to mould yourself, change yourself to the circumstances as required. Christ alive, taking lean into a whole new level. The EHRC, despite its profession to the contrary, is not independent of the government it is meant to hold to account. Its commissioners are appointed by the government. But it is fascinating that so much of its energy is now going into stripping rights from trans people. Shon, why does this particular right-wing institutional capture have such an obsessive focus on trans rights?
The real key to answering that is the fact that they're just being lobbied a lot on trans rights. You mentioned some of the organisations there. I would say that the organisation Sex Matters, which was founded by a number of notable self-described gender-critical feminists in the last couple of years. You can go to their website, snappy little name, Sex Matters. Not as fun as it sounds. And they pretty much are transparent about what they're campaigning for. They set up a petition, a Parliament, UK government and Parliament petition to try and reach 100,000 signatures for precisely this campaign point, which was to redefine sex in the Equality Act to mean biological sex, which, by the way, I just want to say is unpracticable. It's a complete nightmare in and of itself. And I think I'm sure it's been covered on this program, but Helen Belcher, who is a trans campaigner and a Liberal Democrat, will forgive Helen that for now, put this to staff of the EHRC recently. It was like, how are you going to define biological sex? They had no answer, and pointed out that this is out of step with other human rights watchdogs in countries that we might consider, neighbours and friends of the UK. But yeah, they're being lobbied pretty hard. And it's pretty obvious, what the goals are. This one has not come as a surprise. And so I think for people watching at home who may not be aware of this, there's just a very committed lobby now in this country with a number of campaign points about basically, moving towards an ideological position in law that particularly women, are not women and therefore should be treated basically as men for all purposes. That would be their ideal goal. I think they're quite transparent about that. These people give interviews all the time. The other thing is that internally, and you touched on this, Moya, at the EHRC is, I think Baroness Faulkner herself has made her own ideological stance very clear. I think she's just immensely receptive to a lot of these arguments. She is meeting with these organizations. And so you only need a few key individuals at such a sort of like organization, really, for it to start, having somewhat of a bias, let's say that.
Quick warning, for the next story, we will be mentioning child sexual abuse. Home Secretary Suella Braverman is on a mission, and that mission is to demonstrate that people from ethnic minority backgrounds can also say incredibly racist things, and she's doing amazing, sweetie. Most recently, Braverman made some incredibly inflammatory remarks about British Pakistani men and child sexual exploitation.
What we've seen is a practice whereby vulnerable white English girls, sometimes in care, sometimes who are in challenging circumstances, being pursued and raped and drugged and harmed by gangs of British Pakistani men who've worked in child abuse rings or networks.
Now, that claim has sparked ongoing outrage, not least because none of the evidence around group-based child sexual exploitation supports Braverman's claims that it's perpetrated mostly by British Pakistani men. As it has been widely noted, the Home Office's own 2020 research found that the majority of child sexual abuse gangs are made up of white men under the age of 30. That didn't stop Braverman trucking on, though, and now a leading Tory peer has condemned what she calls the Home Secretary's racist rhetoric. Former Conservative Party chair, Baroness Wolsey, has been on a mini media tour attempting to combat some of the damage wrought by what she refers to as Braverman's shock jock language. Writing in The Guardian on Wednesday evening, Wolsey said this: Braverman's own ethnic origin has shielded her from criticism for too long. Many people within the Conservative Party have been hesitant to call out what has been staring members in the face. They struggle to hold an ethnic minority MP to account in the same way they would a white parliamentarian. This needs to change. If we're going to start having honest conversations, let's start by saying this: black and brown people can be racist too. Wolsey goes on to point out this: Braverman is a trained barrister. If somebody who is trained to be an advocate cannot communicate on serious issues in a thoughtful, reasonable, evidence-based way, that's an issue of incompetence. Whether this consistent use of racist rhetoric is strategy or incompetence, however, doesn't matter. Both show she is not fit to hold high office. Criticising Braverman's language is not about shutting down important debate about policy or being culturally sensitive. It's about demanding a Home Secretary who makes policy announcements that are accurate and based on fact and evidence, which Braverman has failed to do. Not fit to hold high office. Pretty unequivocal stuff. Wolsey doubled down on her criticism Thursday morning while speaking to BBC News. I've had to warn my son that if people start swearing and shouting, to just remove himself from the situation to avoid it escalating into an attack. Why should I be having these conversations with my son, she told BBC News. I've had to tell my dad that if you go to the mosque, don't walk home. We need to have someone taking him and bring him back every day. In that piece, Baroness Wolsey said that Suella Braverman's racist rhetoric meant that she was worried about potential attacks upon South Asian individuals. Now, interestingly, in 2012, Baroness Wolsey caused some controversy of her own when she spoke about child sexual exploitation, very hard to get out, in Rochdale. Then she was serving as Tory co-chair, and she told the Evening Standard this: There is a small minority of Pakistani men who believe that white girls are fair game. We have to be prepared to say that. You can only start solving a problem if you acknowledge it first. In mosque after mosque after mosque, this should be raised as an issue so that anybody who is remotely involved should start to feel the community is turning on them. Communities have a responsibility to stand up and say, this is wrong, this will not be tolerated. Now, at the time, Wolsey's comments were spun a bit by the press as putting race at the heart of child sexual exploitation. She claimed she was trying to be nuanced about it and acknowledge a problem. She was criticised, however, by organisations like End Violence Against Women Coalition, who said that an excessive focus on ethnicity in cases of exploitation, rather than the exploitation itself, is misleading. Very, very fair and accurate. But just over a decade later, and Wolsey is making similar critiques of Braverman's language. Is she wrong, though? Shon, what do you make of Baroness Wolsey's apparent change in perspective?
I mean, Saida Wolsey has confused me for the best part of 13 years. I'm always like, hun, do you not know what party you're in? I find her mystifying. I have to preface my answer with that. I wonder, I'm just speculating here, I think at a time when she was on the rise in during the sort of Cameron era of the Conservative-led coalition government, she perhaps somewhat naively believed it, and clearly still does because she remains in the party, in a kind of soft conservatism. It's that kind of same thing as when Theresa May said they were no longer, I can't remember, to paraphrase, the bad guys, when David Cameron was the champion of gay marriage and so on. This idea of a kind of socially progressive but economically conservative party. I think she had a lot of hope invested in that model of conservatism in the UK perhaps 13 years ago. And of course, what she has probably seen in her time is an increasing lurch to the right, not just on economics, but on social policy, including around race too. She has constantly been trying to draw attention to Islamophobia within the Conservative Party. She is aware, obviously, that it has racist tendencies. And I think perhaps now that she is so removed from, real power within the centre of gravity within the Tory party, if you like, she perhaps has cause for reflection. And maybe as well, we just all, with age and experience, we reflect on things. And it's not particularly wise necessarily to be peddling racist rhetoric that sooner or later will be in the hands of people who will lump you in with the people that you are slurring. And that is the case if you are a British Asian Tory politician and you are furthering racist tropes about British Asians. Like, of course, sooner or later, that is going to rebound, if not on you personally, on your family members, on men in your family. So perhaps she's just got eyes and, a bit of common sense about where this can all go. And she doesn't have that thirst for power that she maybe once had and that Suella Braverman currently does.
Suella Braverman's thirst for power is going to take us all down, I fear, and it will be a long time before she actually sees the consequences of becoming a model minority in service of a racist institution. However, on that note, thank you very much, Shon, for joining me tonight and lending your intellect and your chicness, especially to the Louis Vuitton story, where you know that I'm out of my depth.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for the French accent, Moya. It really tickled me.
Well, merci beaucoup for everyone for watching this evening, and come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. with Michael and Aaron. For now, you have been watching Novara Media. Bonsoir.